The WNBA never mentioned Caitlin Clark by name when it announced a series of significant officiating and enforcement changes, but that hasn't stopped fans, analysts, and even some people inside the basketball world from connecting the dots. What initially appeared to be a routine off-season update quickly turned into one of the most debated developments in women's basketball because of the timing and the specific areas the league chose to address. After a rookie season filled with controversy, viral moments, heated debates, and endless discussions about physical play, the league suddenly moved to tighten enforcement standards involving hand-checking, flagrant fouls, off-ball contact, and review procedures. Officially, the changes were presented as efforts to improve consistency and enhance the quality of the game. Unofficially, many fans immediately saw something much bigger. They began asking whether these changes were the league's quiet acknowledgement that something had gone wrong during the most heavily scrutinized rookie season the sport has ever seen. For nearly an entire year, Caitlin Clark became the center of a conversation that extended far beyond basketball. Every hard foul generated national headlines. Every controversial no-call exploded across social media. Every physical confrontation seemed to create another round of arguments between supporters and critics. Some observers believed Clark was experiencing a level of physical treatment that went beyond normal rookie challenges, while others argued that she was simply adjusting to the realities of professional basketball. The disagreement became one of the defining storylines of the season itself. Television segments, podcasts, sports radio shows, former players, analysts, and millions of fans all weighed in with their own opinions. Yet despite all the noise, the league itself largely remained silent, allowing the debate to continue without directly addressing the concerns that had become impossible to ignore. What makes the situation so fascinating now is that the conversation has shifted. The focus is no longer solely on what happened during Clark's rookie year. Instead, attention has turned toward why the league decided to make these changes now and what those changes truly represent. Supporters of Clark view the announcement as validation for concerns they have raised since the opening weeks of the season. Critics argue that the league is simply modernizing officiating standards and that any connection to one player is being exaggerated. Somewhere between those competing viewpoints lies a question that continues to generate enormous interest. If nothing was wrong, why did so many areas of enforcement suddenly need clarification at the same time? The answer depends on who you ask, but the debate itself reveals just how influential Caitlin Clark has become in shaping conversations around the future of the WNBA. As the league enters a new chapter, the stakes feel larger than ever. Teams are being forced to adapt, coaches are reevaluating defensive strategies, players are preparing for a different officiating environment. At the same time, fans are watching closely to see whether these changes will have a noticeable impact on the league's biggest star and on the game itself. The biggest question is no longer whether Caitlin Clark can survive in the WNBA. She already answered that question by producing historic numbers while facing unprecedented attention throughout her rookie season. The question now is what happens when the environment around her changes. And once we look closely at everything that led to this moment, from the controversies and viral incidents to the league's response and the growing frustration from certain corners of the basketball world, a much larger story begins to emerge, one that could shape the future of women's basketball for years to come. Long before the debates about officiating, physical play, and rule changes began dominating headlines, Caitlin Clark arrived in the WNBA carrying expectations unlike anything the league had ever seen before. Even before she played a single professional game, arenas were selling tickets at unprecedented rates whenever the Indiana Fever appeared on the schedule. Television networks were adjusting programming to accommodate increased interest, merchandise sales exploded, social media engagement reached levels that women's basketball had rarely experienced before. For years, the WNBA had been steadily growing, but Clark's arrival accelerated that momentum almost overnight. Whether someone loved her game or doubted the hype surrounding her, there was no denying one reality: people were paying attention. Millions of fans who had never regularly watched WNBA games suddenly found themselves following scores, highlights, and storylines every night. The spotlight wasn't simply brighter than usual, it was operating at an entirely different scale. What made the situation even more remarkable was that Clark wasn't entering the league as a traditional top draft pick. Most rookies spend their first season learning quietly, developing away from constant national attention while veterans control the headlines. Clark never had that luxury. Every game became a national event, every performance was analyzed, every mistake was magnified, every success became a major story. The pressure surrounding her rookie campaign was enormous because she wasn't just expected to perform well. Fairly or unfairly, many people viewed her as the face of the league's next era before she had even played her first professional minute. That level of expectation would have been difficult for any player to handle, yet Clark entered the season facing a challenge that extended beyond basketball itself. She wasn't only adjusting to faster defenders, stronger athletes, and more complex defensive schemes, she was adjusting while carrying the weight of unprecedented public attention on her shoulders. As the season unfolded, something interesting began happening. The numbers justified the excitement. Despite facing experienced veterans every night, Clark quickly demonstrated the same elite court vision, deep shooting range, and playmaking ability that had made her one of the most recognizable athletes in college basketball history. She produced highlight passes that spread across social media within minutes. She hit shots that energized crowds across the country. She consistently found ways to impact games, even while adapting to a completely new level of competition. More importantly, she helped drive viewership figures, attendance records, and overall interest in the league to heights that many analysts had never anticipated. Suddenly, conversations about the WNBA were reaching audiences far beyond traditional basketball circles. Casual sports fans were tuning in, former players were discussing games regularly. Major media outlets that previously devoted limited attention to the league were now covering its biggest storylines almost daily. But with that attention came something else. The basketball itself gradually stopped being the only focus. As the weeks passed, discussions increasingly centered around how opponents were defending Clark and how officials were responding to the physical nature of those matchups. What initially appeared to be isolated incidents began generating broader conversations among fans and commentators. Every hard foul seemed to spark another debate. Every controversial no-call created another round of social media arguments. Every nationally televised game appeared to produce a new clip that fueled discussions about whether Clark was receiving the same treatment as other players around the league. Some believed the attention was exaggerated by a passionate fan base. Others argued the concerns were legitimate and deserved scrutiny. Regardless of which side people supported, one thing became impossible to ignore. The conversation surrounding Caitlin Clark was no longer limited to her basketball skills. The most remarkable aspect of the entire situation was Clark's response. While headlines continued multiplying and debates intensified, she largely stayed focused on playing basketball. She continued showing up night after night, despite the pressure, despite the scrutiny, and despite the endless discussion surrounding her every move. Her production remained impressive, her popularity continued growing, and her influence on the league became increasingly obvious with every passing month. By the middle of the season, it was clear that her rookie year was becoming far more than a simple introduction to professional basketball. It was evolving into one of the most discussed and closely watched seasons any player had experienced in recent memory. Yet for all the excitement, record-breaking numbers, and growing national attention, one moment was about to change the entire conversation. A single incident would ignite debates that extended far beyond basketball and force people across the sports world to take a much closer look at everything that had been happening up to that point. And once that moment occurred, the spotlight surrounding Caitlin Clark's rookie season would become brighter than ever before. For weeks, the conversation surrounding Caitlin Clark had been building steadily. Fans were already debating the physical nature of her rookie season, analysts were breaking down controversial plays, and social media was flooded with clips of hard fouls and intense defensive matchups. But despite all of that attention, the discussions remained largely confined to basketball circles. Then came a moment that changed everything.
Suddenly, a debate that had been simmering beneath the surface exploded into mainstream sports coverage and became impossible for anyone following the league to ignore. What happened next would transform a season-long conversation into a national story. During a matchup between the Indiana Fever and the Chicago Sky, cameras captured an off-ball collision involving Chennedy Carter and Caitlin Clark that immediately drew attention. The play happened away from the action, making it stand out even more. Within minutes, clips of the incident were circulating across social media platforms, sports websites, and television broadcasts. Fans dissected every angle. Former players offered opinions. Sports talk shows dedicated entire segments to discussing what had happened. What made the incident so significant wasn't simply the contact itself, it was the reaction that followed. For many viewers, the play appeared to confirm concerns they had already been expressing for weeks. To them, it wasn't an isolated moment, it was evidence of a larger pattern they believed had been developing throughout Clark's rookie season.
Almost overnight, the conversation expanded far beyond Indiana Fever fans. National media outlets that had barely discussed officiating in the WNBA suddenly found themselves covering the story. Sports personalities weighed in from every angle. Some argued that physical play had always been part of professional basketball, and that Clark was experiencing the same challenges faced by countless rookies before her. Others believed the incident crossed the line and highlighted a growing issue regarding how certain situations involving Clark were being handled. The divide became enormous. Every new opinion seemed to generate another wave of debate, creating a cycle that kept the story dominating headlines for days. What made the situation unique was how quickly it evolved from a discussion about a single play into a broader examination of Clark's entire rookie experience. Fans began revisiting previous games, old clips resurfaced online. Analysts started comparing incidents for earlier in the season. Social media users compiled montages showing various examples of physical contact involving Clark, arguing that the Carter incident was merely the most visible example of something they believed had been occurring for months. Whether those conclusions were completely accurate became a matter of fierce debate, but the public attention surrounding the issue was undeniable. The spotlight had grown larger than any individual game or individual player. At the center of it all was Clark herself. While the sports world argued endlessly about what the incident meant, she continued doing what she had done throughout the season, focusing on basketball. She wasn't launching public campaigns, she wasn't escalating the controversy. Instead, she kept taking the court and producing results under some of the most intense scrutiny any rookie athlete had faced in recent years. That response only fueled the conversation further. Supporters pointed to her composure as evidence of her professionalism, while critics maintained that the attention surrounding the situation had become excessive. Regardless of where people stood, the incident had fundamentally changed the narrative of the season. The real impact of the Carter moment wasn't what happened on the court that day, it was what happened afterward. The incident forced people to start asking bigger questions. Were officials being consistent? Was Clark receiving the same treatment as other players? Had the league underestimated how much attention these situations would receive in the social media era? Those questions continued gaining momentum long after the headlines faded. And as more fans, analysts, and former players began examining the season as a whole, many believed they were noticing patterns that extended far beyond a single controversial play. But for some observers, the Carter incident was only the beginning, because once people started looking closer, they claimed to see a much larger story unfolding, one involving repeated physical battles, growing frustration among fans, and an increasingly intense debate over how the league's biggest new star was being defended. And that broader conversation would soon become one of the defining storylines of the entire season. After the Chennedy Carter incident dominated headlines, something interesting started happening across the basketball world. The focus shifted away from one specific play and toward a much larger question. Fans weren't just debating what had happened during that game anymore. They were asking whether that moment represented part of a broader pattern that had been developing throughout Caitlin Clark's rookie season.
Suddenly, thousands of people were going back through previous games, rewatching footage, sharing clips online, and comparing situations from different points in the season. Every fan seemed to have an opinion, and every new discussion appeared to uncover another example that fueled the growing debate. Whether those examples proved anything definitive remained a matter of disagreement, but there was no denying that the conversation itself had taken on a life of its own. One of the most common topics involved hand-checking and physical defensive pressure. Throughout the season, many fans argued that Clark was facing an unusually aggressive style of defense whenever she brought the ball up the court. Opponents clearly understood the challenge she presented. Her deep shooting range forced defenders to pick her up far from the basket, while her passing ability meant that giving her too much space could be equally dangerous. As a result, teams frequently made her the focal point of their defensive game plans. Supporters of Clark claimed that some of those defensive tactics crossed the line of what officials typically allowed, while others argued that elite players naturally attract tougher defensive attention. The disagreement never fully disappeared because both sides could point to moments that seemed to support their position. The debate became even more intense whenever clips surfaced showing contact away from the basketball. Throughout the season, social media users regularly highlighted possessions where Clark appeared to absorb bumps, grabs, or screens while moving without the ball. Some fans believed these plays demonstrated inconsistent officiating, while others saw them as routine parts of a physical professional league. The more people discussed these moments, however, the more attention they attracted. What might have gone largely unnoticed in previous seasons was now being analyzed frame by millions of viewers. Every controversial sequence generated new arguments, new breakdowns, and new theories about whether officials were applying the rules consistently.
Another element that fueled the conversation was the sheer frequency with which these discussions kept returning. Normally, controversial officiating debates flare up briefly before fading away. That never seemed to happen here. Every time the story appeared ready to disappear, another incident emerged that reignited the controversy. A hard scream, a questionable foul call, a missed whistle, a heated exchange between players. The cycle repeated itself so often that many fans began viewing individual moments as pieces of a larger puzzle rather than isolated events. Fair or not, the perception of a pattern became almost as influential as the incidents themselves. One player who frequently found herself pulled into these discussions was Sophie Cunningham. As the season progressed, many Fever fans began praising Cunningham for her willingness to stand up for teammates during physical games. Online conversations often portrayed her as a protector figure, someone unafraid to respond when tensions escalated on the court. Supporters viewed her toughness as an important asset, while critics argued that physical play and emotional confrontations have always been part of competitive basketball. Regardless of where people stood, Cunningham's role became symbolic of a larger conversation. The fact that fans were celebrating a player's willingness to provide protection reflected how strongly many people felt about the treatment Clark was receiving. What made the entire situation unique was that perception often became reality in the eyes of the public. The more fans discussed physical play involving Clark, the more closely every game was examined. Broadcasters started mentioning it, analysts referenced it during broadcasts, former players were asked about it during interviews. Even people who initially paid little attention to the debate eventually became aware of it because it seemed to appear everywhere. By the middle of the season, conversations about officiating and physicality had become nearly inseparable from conversations about Clark herself. Whether that was fair to her or fair to the league became another debate entirely. At the center of it all was a simple fact that neither side could dispute. Caitlin Clark had become the most discussed player in the sport. Every game involving her generated attention that extended far beyond the final score. Every controversy attracted national coverage. Every viral clip created another round of passionate reactions. And as the season continued, the pressure on the league to address the growing conversation became increasingly difficult to ignore.
The question was no longer whether fans were talking about these issues. They clearly were. The question was whether the people running the league were paying attention as well. And, as it turned out, events behind the scenes were beginning to suggest that they were. As the season continued and the debates grew louder, the pressure surrounding officiating became increasingly difficult for the league to ignore. What began as isolated conversations on social media had evolved into one of the most discussed storylines in professional basketball. Every controversial clip generated millions of views. Every disputed call became the subject of television debates. Every physical encounter involving Caitlin Clark seemed to spark another round of national discussion. Whether league officials agreed with every criticism being made was almost beside the point. The conversation itself had become impossible to avoid. The WNBA suddenly found itself facing scrutiny not only from longtime followers of the sport, but also from millions of new viewers who were watching the league more closely than ever before. What's important to understand is that professional sports leagues rarely respond publicly in dramatic ways. Instead, they tend to operate through reviews, evaluations, meetings, and policy discussions behind the scenes. When questions about officiating consistency begin generating significant attention, leagues typically examine whether current standards are being applied as intended. That doesn't necessarily mean every criticism is correct, but it does mean the issue has reached a level where leadership can no longer simply ignore the conversation. Throughout Caitlin Clark's rookie season, reports and public comments from league officials suggested there was growing awareness of the concerns being raised by fans, analysts, broadcasters, and even some individuals inside the sport itself. As the off-season approached, discussions surrounding officiating consistency became more visible. The league emphasized the importance of maintaining standards that allow skill, athleticism, and competition to remain at the center of the game. There was increasing attention placed on freedom of movement, physical contact, and how existing rules were being enforced across different situations. While officials never publicly framed these discussions around any single player, many observers couldn't help noticing that the areas receiving attention were remarkably similar to the same topics that had dominated conversations throughout Caitlin Clark's rookie season. Hand checking, off-ball contact, physical defensive tactics, review procedures. These weren't random subjects suddenly appearing out of nowhere. They were the exact issues fans had spent months arguing about. Then came the announcement that truly caught people's attention. The league unveiled a series of officiating adjustments and enforcement clarifications aimed at creating greater consistency across games. On paper, the changes sounded technical. They were presented using the kind of formal language sports organizations typically use when updating policies and procedures. Yet beneath the official wording, many fans immediately recognized something familiar. The changes appeared to target several of the exact situations that had fueled controversy throughout the season. For supporters of Clark, the timing felt impossible to ignore. Critics argued that the league was simply improving its product as part of a normal evolution. Both sides interpreted the developments through completely different lenses, but neither side stopped talking about them. What made the response so fascinating was how carefully the league handled it. There was no dramatic announcement connecting the changes to any specific player. No official statement acknowledged that a particular season had influenced the decision-making process. The WNBA maintained the position that these adjustments were designed to improve consistency and strengthen the quality of officiating league-wide. From an institutional perspective, that approach made perfect sense. Sports leagues generally avoid framing policy decisions around individual athletes because doing so creates complications and controversies of its own. Yet that careful approach also created a vacuum, and whenever a vacuum exists in sports, fans rush in to fill it with their own interpretations. For many observers, the real story wasn't what the league said, it was what the league chose to address. The areas receiving clarification happened to overlap almost perfectly with the same concerns that had dominated headlines throughout the previous year. That coincidence, whether intentional or not, became one of the most discussed aspects of the entire situation.
Supporters viewed it as evidence that the league had recognized legitimate problems. Skeptics argued that fans were reading too much into routine officiating adjustments. The truth depended largely on perspective, but one fact remained undeniable. The WNBA had taken action, and those actions instantly became part of the ongoing conversation surrounding Caitlin Clark's impact on the league. Perhaps the most significant consequence wasn't the changes themselves, but the message they sent. Fairly or unfairly, many fans interpreted the response as proof that their concerns had at least been heard. After months of debates, arguments, and viral controversies, there was now something tangible for people to point to. The league had reviewed its standards, it had announced adjustments, it had committed to greater consistency. Whether those decisions were directly influenced by the events of Clark's rookie season would likely remain a matter of speculation, but the perception that something had changed was already taking hold across the basketball world. And while fans continued debating what the league's response really meant, another reaction was beginning to emerge from inside the sport itself. Because not everyone was celebrating these changes. In fact, some teams, coaches, and observers were growing increasingly frustrated by what they believed the new standards could mean for the future of the game. While many fans viewed the league's officiating adjustments as a positive step forward, not everyone inside the basketball world shared that enthusiasm. In fact, almost as soon as discussions about stricter enforcement and greater consistency began gaining traction, a different reaction started emerging from certain corners of the sport. Coaches, analysts, former players, and fans who preferred a more physical style of basketball began expressing concerns about what these new standards could mean moving forward. The frustration wasn't necessarily about Caitlin Clark herself. At least publicly, most critics framed their arguments around something much larger. They argued that basketball has always been a physical game, and that overemphasizing player protection could fundamentally alter how defense is played at the highest level. On the surface, that argument carries a certain amount of logic. Many successful teams have built their identities around aggressive defense. They rely on physical pressure, relentless ball denial, hard screens, and constant disruption to make life difficult for opposing stars. Those tactics aren't simply random acts of physicality. They are often core components of carefully designed defensive systems developed over years of coaching and roster construction. When a league begins emphasizing stricter enforcement in areas like hand checking, freedom of movement, and off-ball contact, some coaches naturally worry about how those adjustments will affect the effectiveness of the strategies they have spent years perfecting. For organizations that pride themselves on physical defense, even small changes in officiating standards can have significant consequences. But beneath the surface, the debate appears to be about something deeper than tactics alone. Throughout sports history, changes in officiating standards have almost always generated resistance from people who benefited under previous interpretations. Whether it's football, baseball, hockey, or basketball, there's often an adjustment period whenever leagues decide to emphasize different aspects of the rulebook. Some players adapt quickly, some struggle. Some teams find creative ways to evolve, others spend years trying to regain the advantages they once enjoyed. That's why discussions surrounding these officiating adjustments have become so emotionally charged. For certain teams, the issue isn't simply whether the rules are changing, it's whether the style of basketball they have relied upon will remain as effective as it once was.
This is where the Caitlin Clark debate becomes impossible to separate from the broader conversation. Many fans believe Clark's rookie season accelerated attention toward officiating issues that might otherwise have remained background topics. Her games generated massive audiences. Her highlights attracted millions of viewers. Her controversies became national stories. As a result, situations that might have previously escaped widespread scrutiny were suddenly being analyzed by an enormous audience. Some observers argue that increased attention naturally led to increased accountability. Others believe the attention created pressure that unfairly influenced how the league approached future decisions. Neither side has fully convinced the other, which is why the debate continues to rage months later. There is also another reality that few people openly discuss. Not every team was affected equally by the changing conversation. Organizations built around speed, spacing, ball movement, and positional defense may experience relatively minor adjustments. Teams whose defensive success relies more heavily on constant physical pressure, however, could face a much steeper learning curve. If officials consistently enforce standards that previously received less attention, certain defensive tactics become riskier. What once resulted in a brief bump or subtle hold may now produce a whistle. What once disrupted an offensive possession could suddenly become a foul. Over the course of an entire season, those differences can dramatically alter outcomes. The frustration expressed by some critics also reflects a broader concern about perception. Many opponents of the changes argue that fans are connecting everything back to one player, creating the impression that league-wide decisions are being made specifically because of Caitlin Clark. Supporters strongly reject that idea, pointing out that the rules already existed and that the conversation revolves around enforcement rather than invention. Still, the perception remains powerful. Whenever a player becomes as influential as Clark has become, almost every major development within the sport ends up being viewed through that lens. Fairly or unfairly, that reality has become part of the modern WNBA landscape. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of the backlash is that it demonstrates how significant these changes are perceived to be. If the adjustments were meaningless, there would be little reason for anyone to object. The fact that coaches, analysts, and fans continue arguing about them suggests that people believe they could genuinely influence how the game is played moving forward. Some view that influence as progress, others view it as unnecessary interference. But regardless of where someone stands, the intensity of the reaction reveals one undeniable truth: the league is entering a new phase, and not everyone is convinced that phase will benefit them. Yet, amid all the arguments, criticism, and resistance, one question continues looming over the entire discussion. If these changes are enforced consistently, what will they actually mean for Caitlin Clark herself? Because for all the attention surrounding rules, officiating, and league politics, the biggest mystery may still be what happens when one of basketball's most dynamic playmakers enters the next chapter of her career under a completely different environment than the one she faced as a rookie. For all the debate surrounding officiating, enforcement standards, and league policy, the most fascinating question remains the simplest one. What happens when Caitlin Clark no longer has to spend as much energy fighting through the kinds of situations that fueled so much controversy in the first place? Whether someone believes the concerns surrounding her rookie season were overstated or completely justified, there is little disagreement about one thing. Clark entered the league under extraordinary circumstances and still managed to produce numbers that placed her among the most impactful players in professional basketball. She wasn't merely surviving against elite competition, she was generating offense at a level few rookies have ever achieved, while carrying the expectations of an entire sport on her shoulders. That reality is what makes the next chapter so intriguing. What separates Clark from many great players is not simply her ability to score. The foundation of her game has always been speed of decision-making. Long before defenders react, she is already identifying passing lanes, recognizing mismatches, and anticipating opportunities that others fail to see until it is too late. Her greatest weapon is often not her shooting range or ball handling, but the pace at which she processes information. Every second matters. Every inch of space matters. Every defensive hesitation matters. When she has room to operate, the entire floor changes. Defenders are forced to extend farther from the basket. Passing angles open. Teammates find themselves with better scoring opportunities. The effect spreads across every possession. That is why so many analysts believe that even small changes in officiating consistency could have a disproportionately large impact on her effectiveness. Supporters of Clark often point to an important detail that gets lost during heated debates. Throughout her rookie season, she continued producing elite numbers despite constantly being the center of defensive attention. Opponents built game plans around slowing her down. Every arena she entered was packed with fans eager to watch her play. Every opponent understood that containing Clark was often the first priority. Despite those challenges, she remained one of the league's most productive offensive players. To many observers, that raises an obvious question. If she was capable of achieving that level of success under those conditions, what happens if the environment becomes even more favorable to her style of play?
There is a growing belief among some analysts that the league may not have fully seen Clark's offensive ceiling yet. During portions of her rookie season, she often appeared to be balancing multiple responsibilities at once. She had to learn a new system, develop chemistry with professional teammates, adjust to the speed of the league, handle unprecedented media attention, and navigate the physical demands of a long professional season. Most rookies spend years working through those challenges. Clark did it while becoming one of the most discussed athletes in sports. The experience she gained during that process may prove just as valuable as any statistical achievement. Players frequently make their biggest leap after their first season because the game begins to slow down mentally. The situations that once felt overwhelming become familiar. The mistakes become lessons. The uncertainty becomes confidence. If officiating adjustments produce the kind of consistency the league hopes to achieve, the benefits for Clark could extend beyond statistics. One of the biggest advantages may be durability and efficiency. Basketball is not simply about talent, it is also about energy management. Every possession requires physical effort. Every game contributes to wear and tear over the course of a season. Reducing unnecessary physical battles allows players to focus more energy on the aspects of the game where they create the most value. For a player whose greatest strengths involve creativity, vision, and offensive orchestration, even marginal improvements in freedom of movement can create significant advantages over time. At the same time, expectations are likely to become even higher. Success often creates its own challenges. Opposing coaches are spending entire off-seasons studying Clark's tendencies. Defenders are becoming more familiar with her strengths. Teams are developing new strategies designed specifically to limit her impact. The attention surrounding her isn't disappearing anytime soon. If anything, it continues growing with every milestone she reaches. The pressure to perform will remain enormous because she is no longer viewed as simply a promising rookie. She is increasingly viewed as one of the faces of the league itself. That level of responsibility can elevate a player, but it can also create new obstacles. What makes the situation especially compelling is that Clark's influence now extends far beyond her own performance. Ticket sales, television ratings, sponsorship interest, social media engagement, and national coverage all seem connected to her presence in some way. Fair or unfair, the league's future growth is frequently discussed alongside her development. That means every improvement in her game carries implications that stretch beyond Indiana's win-loss record. Fans aren't just watching to see whether she becomes an all-star or wins championships. They're watching to see how far she can push the boundaries of what women's basketball can become. And that's why the next phase of this story feels so important. The debates about officiating may eventually fade. The controversies from her rookie season will become part of history. The arguments on social media will move on to new topics. But the impact of what happens next could last for years. Because if Caitlin Clark truly is entering a version of the league that provides greater consistency, more freedom of movement, and fewer distractions, then the basketball world may finally get to see something it has only glimpsed in flashes so far. And that possibility leads directly to the biggest question of all. Years from now, when people look back on this period in WNBA history, will they remember it simply as Caitlin Clark's rookie season? Or will they remember it as the moment one player permanently changed the direction of an entire league? The most fascinating part of this entire story may not be the controversy, the officiating debates, or even the rule changes themselves. It may be the legacy question that now hangs over all of it. Because when sports fans look back years from now, they rarely remember every individual game, every social media argument, or every headline that dominated a particular week. What they remember are the turning points. They remember the moments when a player arrived and altered the trajectory of a league. They remember the athletes who forced conversations that previously weren't happening. And whether someone is a devoted Caitlin Clark supporter or one of her harshest critics, there is growing evidence that her rookie season represented exactly that kind of moment for the WNBA. Before Clark entered the league, women's basketball was already growing. Talented stars had spent years building the foundation. Television audiences were increasing, corporate sponsorships were expanding, attendance numbers were moving in the right direction. The sport was making meaningful progress. But there is a difference between growth and acceleration. Growth happens gradually.
Acceleration changes everything. When Clark arrived, the scale of attention surrounding the league shifted almost immediately. Arenas sold out, road games became major events, television ratings surged. Sports media outlets that had rarely discussed the WNBA suddenly found themselves covering the league on a daily basis. New fans entered the sport by the millions. Many had never watched a complete WNBA game before. Now they were following standings, learning player names, and debating officiating decisions online. Whether people loved Clark or questioned the amount of attention she received, the impact itself became impossible to deny.
That is why the legacy conversation extends far beyond statistics. Years from now, people will certainly discuss Clark's assists, scoring records, and individual achievements. They will analyze championships, awards, and playoff performances. But those accomplishments may ultimately become only one part of a much larger story. The broader question is whether her arrival accelerated changes that might otherwise have taken years to occur. Did the increased attention lead to greater accountability? Did it force difficult conversations about officiating consistency? Did it encourage the league to evaluate certain aspects of its product more closely? These questions don't have simple answers, and different people will continue reaching different conclusions. Yet, the fact that these discussions are happening at all reflects the influence Clark has already had on the sport. Perhaps the most significant part of her legacy will be the opportunities created for players who come after her. Future rookies entering the league may never fully understand what it was like during the period when every game involving Caitlin Clark seemed to generate national headlines. They may not remember the debates that dominated sports television or the endless arguments that filled social media feeds. What they will experience, however, is the environment that emerged afterward. They will enter a league with larger audiences, greater media attention, stronger commercial opportunities, and more visibility than previous generations could have imagined. Whether those developments are directly connected to Clark or simply part of the sport's natural evolution will remain a matter of debate. But her role in that transformation will always be part of the conversation. Another reason the legacy question feels so important is because it highlights the unique position Clark occupies within modern sports. Very few athletes become symbols of broader change during their first professional season. Most players spend years building their influence before their impact extends beyond the court. Clark's experience was different. Almost immediately, she became associated with discussions about growth, visibility, officiating, media coverage, player treatment, and the future direction of the league. That level of influence creates enormous pressure, but it also creates extraordinary opportunity. Every season she plays will add another chapter to a story that is already much larger than basketball itself. Of course, legacies are never determined in real time. History has a way of simplifying events that feel complicated while they are happening. The arguments that seem overwhelming today often become footnotes years later. What remains are the outcomes. Did the league continue growing? Did the game reach new audiences? Did the next generation benefit from the changes that occurred during this period? Did Clark fulfill the immense expectations placed upon her? The answers to those questions will ultimately shape how this era is remembered. But regardless of what happens next, one fact already appears increasingly difficult to dispute. Caitlin Clark's rookie season was not merely another debut campaign by a talented young player. It became one of the most influential seasons in modern women's basketball history. And perhaps that is why the story continues generating so much passion from every side. Because at its core, this isn't simply a debate about officiating, physical play, or league policy. It is a debate about change itself. It is about what happens when a transformational athlete enters a sport at exactly the moment that sport is ready to explode into a new era. Some people celebrate that change. Others resist it. Some view it as progress. Others see it as disruption. But history shows that truly transformative figures almost always create both reactions at the same time. Years from now, fans may disagree about the controversies. They may disagree about the rule changes. They may even disagree about how much influence Caitlin Clark actually had on the decisions that followed her rookie season.
But one thing seems increasingly certain. The WNBA that exists today is not the same WNBA that existed before she arrived. And if that trend continues, the ultimate legacy of this period may not be a single statistic, a single game, or even a single championship. It may be the moment an entire league entered a new chapter, and the player who happened to be standing at the center of it when that chapter began.